Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Chantal Dresner, and I'm the Marketing Director at BioSpace. I'll be moderating today's session. So for those of you who are not actually familiar with BioSpace, we are the leading news and careers site for the life sciences community. We have about 1.5 million life science professionals active on the BioSpace platform each month. And we also produce research reports on recruitment strategies, compensation benchmarking, and of course, diversity and inclusion, which is a subject that is of utmost importance to us as a business, as it is to many others. And that, of course, leads us to our event here today, fostering diversity and inclusion in the workplace. So in our recent diversity and inclusion report, it highlighted some key issues that we're really looking forward to discussing with our panelists today. We have a great group assembled here, and I thank them so much for joining us. Would you guys like to introduce yourselves before we get started?
Absolutely, I'll start. So I'm Jennifer Peterson, Chief People Officer from Obsidian Therapeutics.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jennifer Vasquez, Amgen Global Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging.
Great. Hi. Hello, everybody. I'm Mahesh Karande. I'm the President and CEO of Omega Therapeutics.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marika Sanamon. I'm the head of HR at Intellia Therapeutics.
Hi, everyone. Mark Litton, Chief Operating Officer for Athera.
Awesome. Thanks so much and welcome. So I'm basically going to kick off straight away and open up the discussion. First of all, diversity and inclusion can mean different things to different people and organizations. So I thought we would actually start off by exploring what having a diverse and inclusive culture in the workplace actually means to you. Jennifer, do you want to maybe start us off?
Happy to, thank you. So first, let's start with diversity. And diversity to me is a matter of representation, so that the team includes people from different backgrounds, identities, and experiences. And then an inclusive culture is really shaped by the stories we tell and the individual and collective experiences we have. So an inclusive culture, in my point of view, is one where leaders in the stories they tell are recognizing and appreciating the value and contributions from people across the team. It's one where rewards are not a zero-sum game. It's a place that really does not breed a sense of when others benefit, I lose. It's one where there is a deliberate and concerted effort to seek people of different backgrounds and experiences and invite those voices into the team. And finally, I would say it's one where it doesn't require conformity to a specific type to succeed.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Any other further thoughts from anyone? Anyone want to pitch in?
I mean, I can just add, I mean, Jennifer hit, everything really on the mark. I mean, I think, essentially, from an inclusion standpoint, it's, creating an environment where basically people can bring themselves and their best selves at work. I think, we hire people of diverse backgrounds, in every which way. And we need to create an environment where actually we celebrate that and allow people to be who they are. I mean, and allow is also a very strong word. I think that should be the culture, that people should just be who they are. We spend most of our, living life at work, right? Mm-hmm. That's kind of how I think about it. But Jennifer, everything you said is right on the mark.
Absolutely. For us, it's also the structures that are in play as well. When we think about inclusivity, it's really the behaviors and structures in creating that culture, and really diversity. They can't exist without the other. And so while we focus on diversity because it's the easy quantifiable, right, to measure, we often find that there's the gap of inclusion and belonging, and that's really a longer term journey because it really requires deconstructing the structures. I call it the 3Ds in DIMB. It's really deconstructing, demystifying, and disrupting. And it's, the disrupting the status quo, demystifying what DIMB, which at Amgen we identify DIMB because belonging is also very critical to that from an equitable lens. And certainly deconstructing the structures that were built, barriers and biases.
I love that.
So following on from that, so I mean, a lot of organizations and a lot of leaders, they will claim that they value a diverse and inclusive culture, but for organizations, what can they actually do that goes, beyond lip service and it goes beyond just checking the box? Like, what are tangible things that they can do?
I'm happy to get that started.
Yeah.
The conversation started. So we all recognize we're at a critical juncture, and if recent history has taught us anything, is that checking the box is not enough. And while this space has existed for over 30, 40 years, it hasn't been till recent where leaders are being held accountable, whether it be through public, accountability, through social media, things of that nature. Recognizing that employees are also looking at their senior leadership to see how they're taking the response and going beyond the bold statement. How is this going beyond one historical moment? With the murder of George Floyd, this is not a one-time incident. So how do you continue on this journey, recognizing that it is behavioral shifts, and again going back to the structure, but also putting the resources. We recently allocated a substantial amount towards social justice. So just looking at opportunities and also investing a great deal within the work of the DIMB team and expanding it where all people managers, all senior leaders are going to be held accountable. And so looking at measurements like even performance, how is your compensation being tied to this? And so, for us, it's looking at this very holistically and again going beyond the check the box and investing.
And do you like receive any feedback from employees, or what are their thoughts when they see you doing these things? Like, how do they react, and what feedback do you get from them?
I will say most recently, we often hear, how are things changing? We of course have folks that are a little cynical, of course, because again, this space has been around for so long and we still haven't seen the movement and progress that we all, are committing to within this space to do. So little gains have been made. However, when we really look at what does the organization look like even a year ago, and it's right. Day and night. I mean, we've seen an increase in our ERG community. We've seen global movements and interest, and senior leaders holding forums to have safe and courageous conversations. And so taking a very bold approach to see the transformation that needs to happen. And the feedback has been positive for the most part. We obviously get those that question, the biases, do they really exist? And so, we work to ensure that we are in a learning journey together, and that we have to come from that educational lens. And so that's where we create the safe spaces, even those that are reluctant to really understand why it matters. Right. It's educating them and working side by side in partnership to again demystify what DIMB is, and not just this acronym that seems to be trending now more than ever.
Right. Now, I mean, Amgen's obviously, a large company with a lot of resources. I mean, that can look, and D&I can look very different depending on the kind of type of organization that you're at. And, from our research, we've actually seen that employees have quite different experiences and perceptions depending on whether they're at a larger or a smaller organization. So, how do startups and how do smaller organizations begin to build successful, diverse and inclusive cultures? I mean, do you, I'm looking at, you, Mark, for example, do you feel that startups or smaller companies have an advantage or a disadvantage regarding D&I in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. It's a good slow pitch. Because, you know, as an emerging smaller organization, we're roughly 30 employees, we really have the ability to create our culture from the start. So, I mean, just listening to Amgen there, you know, they have 20, 30 years plus of culture that they sort of need to change or evolve, let's call it. For us, we've really created our culture from the start. And it really has started from the top. Our founder and CEO is a millennial working mother, immigrant from Jordan, where diversity and inclusion are really, really important. So we've had the advantage starting from the beginning to emphasize who we're hiring, how we're creating this culture, and really we pride ourselves being sort of multilingual, multi-generational. Today, with our 30 employees, we're 54% female. We're 50% female in the C-suite. And we work really hard on inclusion. I mean, that's really important for us.
I mean, I could add a little bit to that, Chantal, and I think Mark said it right, in terms of, I think the culture and the ethos really does start from the top. And I do agree that, you know, startups and smaller companies have an advantage where you can actually create a culture. I mean, it really depends. I mean, there are companies that go through various cycles. Look, I mean, at Omega, you know, I feel fortunate that we have been able to have the ability to do that. And, you know, it really starts with sort of an alignment on ethos, alignment on the values and behaviors, and alignment on what, you know, what really matters in terms of, you know, how we grow the company, right? You know, we are at 50 people now, and, you know, still much smaller than Amgen, right? Almost double the size of you guys, you know, there, Mark. But, you know, these challenges, you know, have to be tackled head on by the leadership, by role modeling. Right now, when you ask about advantages and disadvantages of, you know, big companies versus startups, I mean, one of the challenges that startups do face is many roles can actually have an existential impact on a startup, right? And, you know, while you would definitely want to make sure that you have the right diversity, you know, in terms of all kinds of differences. I mean, I think there are gender differences, there are, you know, orientation differences, there are, you know, background differences, etc. There's differences of mindsets, right? Sometimes it's hard to actually, you know, just sort of put a stake in the ground when you can have an existential issue with a particular role. Startups can also, depending on the life cycle that they're in, you know, the level of funding, you know, the kind of company may or may not be able to attract talent. I mean, especially if you're in a biotech startup in Boston like we are, you know, there's a tremendous war for talent. So I would argue that, you know, on the surface of it, it can look difficult, but to be honest, I think, you know, culture and ethos plays a huge role in terms of attracting people. I think in one way, it's easier for startups to build that culture and build that ethos, you know, into how you actually build that company. So I would argue that it can be easier in that sense.
And so, you know, obviously, you know, for many companies that, you know, they do grow rapidly, and things can change for a business and an organization very quickly. You know, we have found that, you know, at larger organizations, as a company starts to get bigger, employees are actually more likely to have participated in D&I training programs. There's, you know, a larger variety of programs, for example, obviously because the company has more resources. But they were also less likely to feel like people of all backgrounds were actually treated fairly. So how can organizations ensure that their D&I strategies are successful, that they're working as they continue to grow and as they start to scale? Marika, I know that.
Yeah,
Sure.
I'm happy to take that. So we're about just north of 300 people. We'll be adding another 100 people by the end of the year. And this is something my team and I spend a lot of time thinking about, that I talked to the leadership team about. It's important that you have strong practices, and certainly as you're growing, you want to look at your recruiting practices. You want to make sure that you're not just sort of recruiting the same sorts of people from the same places that you always have been, right? It does present you that opportunity. The thing that I do think a lot about, though, is we have this wonderfully inclusive culture that has been created by some of the things that we as a culture have done for a long time. And I'll give you a couple of examples of those, but these are the things that I really don't want to lose. So for example, our CEO sits down with every new employee in the company. He has meetings every couple of weeks. New employees come together, they sit in a room. He gives them a little bit of the history of Intellia, but then he also uses it as an opportunity to learn about them. Tell me your background, tell me where you're from, what did you do before this? How did you find yourself here? He then takes that and actually puts it into an email and sends it out to the organization. And it's this collection of beautiful stories of basically where people came from and how we all ended up in the same place.
Mm-hmm.
It's much more personal. We learn about each other. Sometimes there's maps of where people came from, foods of where they're from. But I think it sets a tone from the beginning that we are a place where we want everyone to feel like they are part of it and they can add to it. We, celebrate different cultural events like Lunar New Year. So that stuff to me is just really, really important. We have in one of our offices, I'll give you another example. We have a big map. And when you show up on your first day, on your desk is a little picture and a push pin. And you are welcome to go put your face up to where you're from. And you find people just gathered around the map talking about it. Oh, I didn't know so-and-so was from there.
Yeah, it's a great conversation
It's a way
starter.
to sort of celebrate that difference. And so for me, as we grow, it's like making sure you have the right policies is of course important, but I'd say equally, if not more important, is to make sure that those things that got you where you were, those things that sort of make up who you are, you don't lose those things. And I want us to keep celebrating those differences in as many ways as we can.
And it obviously helps, create really positive relationships from colleagues, whether they're peers or managers, and just creating this culture of, interest and compassion with other people, I think is, I think that's really important.
I'd like to just add one thing. I mean, I think it's really important to share examples of inclusion. And one of the things that we do, so we have an all company hands meeting once a month, and we really start the meeting with our values. And we always share an example of those values that's happened from the month. And we encourage people to submit their examples. And so we continually talk about our values and share that on a continuous basis.
Yeah, reinforcement is,
Totally.
Really important. It's important to live it as well, and then communicating it. So, kind of leading on from that, then in terms of communicating to your internal employees. So, we've actually found that perceptions of an organization, whether you're an internal employee or whether you're an outsider, can actually be quite drastically different. So how do you communicate those values, like the value of diversity and inclusion? How do you communicate those internally to your employees and then, externally as well to attract and, actually retain key talent?
Yeah. Chantal, I can take that. So look, I mean, I think, it's the previous conversation is a great segue into this question, right? I mean, I think, Mark just talked about, sharing those, the value of diversity and inclusion, right? I mean, I think, look, one of the things that, I talked about earlier is setting the tone, setting the standard, role modeling, defining the company's ethos, values and behaviors that reflects that, right? Is all very important. Unless you do that, look, I mean, I think, we are dealing with, a completely new generation of people, millennials, and, who value this. And if you're sitting in a place like Cambridge, if you're saying one thing and actually behaving differently and people don't feel that and sense that, you're not going to be able to retain people. I think that piece is extremely important. So one of the things that we do is we want to make sure that our leaders role model those values and beliefs. And, from an Omega, and I'm being very specific, what we also do is, look, it's a high performance organization, but there are two dimensions to it. One is a performance and the other one is, making sure that people actually follow our values and behaviors and people get rated on that, right? So that's one sort of small tactic, but I think that magnifies the importance of values and behaviors, and values and behaviors are grounded in an ethos of inclusion, right? Equity and inclusion. Diversity is, like I said, about bringing the right people in. I think once that happens, and that is super important, equity and inclusion is what, carries you every day, right? And I think that that's important. Now, look, externally speaking, right? I mean, internally, what other things that we can do, like Mark said, is we have this monthly newsletter where we give spot awards based on values behaviors that employees give spot awards to peers, and that is the best
Right.
recognition than from the
Yeah.
CEO of the company or from a leader of the company, right? That's what we are trying to engender. Now, when it comes to the outside world, look, in interviews, I mean, when I interview people, I actually do spend time talking about our values and behaviors and what it means to work at Omega, and whether it's a fit for people, right? Because that's really important. Everybody, I want to make sure that we paint the right picture about the company to prospective employees, and they understand what they would be getting into and what they would actually be expecting from us, and what we'll expect from them. That's one piece. The other piece is, look, I mean, I think these days with social media, etc., there's a tremendous opportunity to really communicate this broadly to the outside world, and I think we do that pretty well. And that is not checking the box. And I think checking the box, you'll be held accountable for by your employees and people who come in. So I think retention rates, etc., are very important. And I think finally, look, at the end of the day, internally or externally, authenticity is the most important thing, right? And unless you have authenticity about what you're talking about in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it won't work. So those are the things that we actually feel are important, and that we try to engender in our behavior, in everything that we do.
I think Mahesh's point on authenticity is such an important one, particularly when you're projecting it externally. And I think the best way to do that is through employee voices. We'll sit down and have a conversation with employees, just describe the experience and let that be the source of the story you tell. When we try to craft it ourselves, it comes across as very inauthentic. And even better than that, when our employees are willing to go out and tell the story on social media themselves. And at my last company, we did a lot of that. At Obsidian, I've only been here for going on 3 months, and we're just starting to begin that. But I think the authenticity piece is absolutely critical.
Right. It's giving the platform to people who actually have that lived experience and who are actually experiencing firsthand, and allowing them to sort of speak for themselves and to highlight their own experiences. I think that's really important. Any Mark?
Yeah. I just wanted to add. So it's a little thing, but so we talk about equity, right? And one of the things, we were one of the first companies to require that everyone use a common background in their virtual setting. Even though I'm shamelessly pitching my clinical trials, this is not our common background. Everybody has the same common background. And what we found is then everybody's the same, right? Even though you're in some small apartment or you're X, Y, and Z, it really has, just a little thing.
Yeah.
Make sure that everybody feels included and it's all equitable.
That's great.
Yeah, I want to just, Chantal, I want to add, it's really interesting when we talk about our narrative internally and externally, because we're shaping a lot of it now as we speak because of a lot of the transformation that's happened more recently. But it's interesting, Mahesh's point in terms of the culture fit, because one of the things that we're looking at is, as a larger company and having been around for some time or longer, is what is the culture at? What is the culture that we're really looking to create? And how we're, to be authentic, it's really allowing for that transformation to happen within the culture, right? Because oftentimes, and I will speak even as a Latina within the space, you have to fit into a certain box to be in that culture and to fit into that culture. And so that's where you're starting to hear a lot around code switching and more recently with our Black and African American communities. And so, as we think about the narrative is really, what are we aiming to be? Who, our identity as we continue, as a 40-year-old, like now we're sort of reinventing ourselves in a way, company. So I think it's really the dynamics with a larger company versus a startup. I think that goes back to the advantages and some of the challenges that we face in a larger setting.
Yeah. Hey, Chantal, if I can just add one thing, I think this theme came up a few times. Look, one of the things that I find very interesting, and again, we are a young startup, and one of the things that I've been talking to my team about is this whole concept, and I think it goes back to what Jen was saying, is my omega. What does my omega mean? Right. And that actually, once you have a background of ethos, culture, values, behavior, and then you actually start layering that, because there's definitely going to be diversity and differences. We don't want everybody to be clones of one another, for sure. Right? Then you lose the fun. So I think that concept of my omega, and what does it mean to every employee? And you can substitute omega with anybody, any other name, right? But I think that concept is really, really important.
Right, well, I'm gonna shift focus a little bit. So when we did our research, we actually found that 35% of the respondents that we surveyed, they admitted that they knew of employees who had experienced discrimination at their organization. So obviously that would be concerning for any business to hear. But so firstly, how do we create a workplace where employees would feel comfortable reporting potential incidences? And then of course, how do you actually take steps as an employer to further minimize those numbers and to actually, stop those kind of incidents from actually happening?
I can weigh in on that. So this is something we actually, as we do our engagement survey, we always ask people whether they're comfortable speaking up. And we did have a situation a couple of years ago where scores were less than one would hope for. That said, I do think there are very real steps you can take. We made a huge investment in our managers, listening skills, helping people understand different communication styles. Our executive team had many discussions about it. It was something that I think the org really took to heart and we had to contend with and say, how do we turn this around? The other piece of it is really making sure those leaders, the HR people, all the folks who someone might actually go to report something are approachable and you can talk to them, and they're not people who show up when you're in trouble, like you don't go see HR when there's a problem, but really making sure that you have those relationships in the organization and open dialogue and people can express differing opinions. Fastest way to stop people reporting is someone says something you disagree with and you shut them down, right? And so as a company, we had to contend with that, but I think we made tremendous strides. But it takes time, and you really have to invest the time to make sure people understand. People communicate in different ways, and that's okay. And we got to listen to each other, and we got to sit down, we got to have the hard conversations. But you really got to be approachable.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I always, with employee incidents, I approach it from the psychological safety. I mean, there's obviously different phases of that, and people are at different parts of that journey. And I know that a lot of corporations across industries face this in terms of underreporting, and in your diversity report, it was about a third of employees stated they know employees that experience discrimination. And it was interesting to see even the data of the disagree and agree. I mean, we have to recognize that right now we're in a very volatile state as it relates to the job market, and staff are more reticent than ever before, and many are in a perpetual state of fear because of job security. And so while many may face a lot of the discrimination, whether it be, the protected classes from the law perspective, or it may be something that is an unconscious bias that may require an intervention like coaching, that we take that from that safety approach to really communicate from the top down that we're all accountable to co-creating this space, and when you have that when you create that safety, people are much more trusting in terms of sharing their experiences. And we experienced that, and I would say more prominently over the last 6 months of 2020, where people were outright sharing their experiences and what they faced in and out of Amgen. And so For me, it's really a three-pronged approach between the psychological safety, really looking at your policies and procedures, how you're communicating that. Many folks, when they're dealing with an incident and they're trying to process it, they really don't know where to go. And so there's this level of anxiety and stress, and then of course the concern. And one of the great things that we do is we work really closely with our staffing relations. And so with employment law to really ensure there's a DIMB lens in the processes and procedures, and where we can distinguish between what is, prohibited by law and reinforcing that here are the consequences, this is not going to be tolerated, versus, violation of our values, which may not be, a law violation, but it's against our policy in terms of our values, and what we're trying to create as a culture. And so that's where the DIMB lens comes into play. And we have that proactive relationship where we ensure that, okay, if it is a bias and it's an unintended consequence of that bias, what is the intervention? Is it a matter of mediation? Is it coaching? Is it ongoing micro learnings? And that's where we take the cue of, here are the resources to help support. And a lot of it is also supporting the expansion of leadership competencies around cultural intelligence, emotional intelligence, which are two competencies that are not required to be a people manager when you look at position descriptions, right? And so now we're trying to embed that into that, process, and as we look at our policies and structures.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I could add a little bit. I mean, what Jen said, right? I mean, I think it makes so much sense. And especially when you're a large organization like Amgen, right? I mean, I used to sit on Novartis's corporate D&I committee, and everything that you say is very familiar to me, right? But I'll just give a perspective from a smaller company, a startup, right? I mean, I think we obviously don't have these processes, and we don't have laid out policies, right? But one of the things that is super critical to emphasize, if you believe in it, and that's what your culture is, and that's what DI means to you, is this whole concept of speak up, right? And look, I mean, you can say that till you go blue in the face if you're the CEO of the company, or you're the a C-level or a vice president level leadership team member. What does that mean to the whole organization? There has to be very clear understanding of that. And speak up, you ensure that, you allow that, and you draw that out. That's what. And once, if somebody does speak up, then you got to listen. And look, I mean, we have had situations where, if, Jen, you brought up this issue about sort of legality and, policy, values, behavior violation. Where do you draw the line in a small company? And I think, look, we are as good as our people and our values and behavior. And I think if you let one incident go by, you basically have destroyed the culture. So I think making sure that you take the right steps. So while you're a high performance organization, you want to make sure that, just because you're a great performer, values and behaviors, you're not exempt, and action will be taken. And we have done that. And I think those kinds of sort of almost public, or as public as you can make them, right? Obviously with privacy, etc., under consideration, is very, very important. And unless you do those things, you can't sort of build a sustainable organization.
And Mish, if I could just make one other point, right? Right now we're living in this virtual community, right? And I think it's even more important to ensure that people have a voice, because what happens on these Zoom meetings, and we've all lived it, is somebody just is quiet and they don't say anything. So one of the things that we have really tried to do is encourage everyone to know their HR person personally. And we have encouraged everyone, if anyone wants to talk to me, wants to talk to our CEO, we are always open. And so we have that open door policy, and it's really easy as a small organization to do that. But the other thing that we really encourage is open communication and away from the Zoom. Unfortunately, get on your phone, talk to somebody. How can you touch them without the Zoom meetings?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that's something that I found when I was onboarded to, BioSpace as an example, it was a virtual onboarding. Everything was done completely remotely. And one of the things that they did that I really valued was that they set the example, as, Mark and Ash, you've all been saying is you have to set the example. And so at the start, it can be a little bit overwhelming, but when you're looking to build those relationships with people and, build that kind of culture of open communication, they were constantly messaging me and reaching out to me and being the one to take the first step, because it can be intimidating as an employee when you're joining an organization, right? So I think it is important that, whether it's HR or whether it's, leadership, depending on the size of your organization, that you are taking those first steps and being the one to open that door. I think that I agree. That's really critical. So I don't know if there's any more comments on that subject, but otherwise I might shift focus a little bit again, unless there's any final comments. Okay, so again, a bit of a shift. So our survey showed that there are pretty clear divisions and pretty large disparities on perceptions of employees depending on their political affiliation. So given the state of things at the moment, how do you create a cohesive environment in the workplace when it's obvious that there is quite clear divisions, surrounding political affiliation?
I'll take that. This is a hard one, and I think 2020 was challenging for many of us with everything going on. When we sat down as a leadership team and said, what do we want to say about this, whether it was the Capitol riots, whatever the particular day was, it's important to us as an organization that we talk about those things that unify us, right? The last thing you want to do is alienate some of your employees because you've taken one political stance versus another. And so we tried to do a couple of things, first, what are the things we agree on, and how do we talk about this stuff through the lens of our values? One of our values is one. It's a reference to one team. We work together. We do great things together. And so we try to keep in mind, what do we have in common? The other thing is giving people space to talk, to process, to listen to each other. The day of the Capitol riots, I happened to have a one-on-one with my CEO. I know he was on investor calls all morning, and I get on the phone with him and I'm like, you probably haven't even looked at the news, but I'm thinking we have a town hall tomorrow. I'm going to clear out half of the topics on there so we can just have a discussion. And it wasn't a management talk to employees. It was I want to make space for people to share their experiences, their reactions, their thoughts, and to be able to talk about that. And we had one employee who was like, look, I'm an immigrant. I actually saw this in my home country. We had someone else who was like, yeah, my parents were immigrants. Like, it was, horrible to watch a bunch of violence happening in the Capitol. And so what we really try to do is look at this stuff through that lens. We have a very active employee population. We are a CRISPR company. People who work on CRISPR tends to be people who want to change the world, right? We are working on medicines that are potentially cures for diseases. That doesn't stop at work. That mentality extends out, right? These are folks who are very active in the community, who are very active, who were protesting earlier in the year. And so one of the things we try to do as an organization and say, okay, how can we help here, right? And so we ended up raising a bunch of money for UNCF, and we're putting that towards scholarships for STEM students, because that is a way we can help underrepresented minorities get into the sciences and get a good education. That's something we could all get behind, right? We all believe in STEM, we all believe in education. So it's about kind of using what happened and looking at it through our lens and our values and saying, all right, where do we want to spend our time? We now have mentorship programs that didn't exist before. And so a lot of good has come out of what I would argue was a pretty rough thing to watch, but our employees really sort of came together and said, here are some things we want to do. We think we should put some money behind it. We think we should do some mentoring programs. We think we should do some outreach. We're going to commit to some interns and co-ops from underrepresented students. Like, those are great things. And so as I think about it, I think what you really have to do is sort of think about, like, what do we all have in common, guys? And can we get behind that and use this to do some good in the world?
Any further thoughts from anyone else on that point?
I can add a little bit of additional context in terms of not just what Amgen has done, but even across corporate America. I think, you know, it's been known, or historically politics has been very polarizing, and probably the most polarizing time, you know, in 2020 for all of us, which, you know, globally was recognized as well. So, you know, for those conversations, I go back to that psychological safety. I mean, it's really important for people not to feel alienated or isolated for their political views. We get grounded on our values, going to Marika's statement, in terms of the values of respect and trust, and coming from an educational lens. So not, you know, always assuming good intent. And when you're having these conversations, you can agree to disagree, but walk away, you know, with a respectful view of where the other person is coming from. And so politics is no longer off the table. I mean, the virtual environment, we've brought everyone into our homes, and the lines have completely blurred of our private and personal versus our public and you know, who we are when we come to the workplace. And again, if we talk about authenticity and inclusion and belonging, that has to be inclusive of all diverse voices. So we really focused on having those type of forums where, you know, of course, if it's against our values, or if there's people that are being explicit, you know, then that's when it's in violation of our policy. And so we try to focus again in grounding everyone on those rules. And obviously we want people to live the values that, you know, and to be an employee, you should want to live those values. And if not, then perhaps it's not the right place for you, right? So, you know, for us, it's really ensuring that people don't feel polarized, but that there's an opportunity for constructive and robust dialogue. You know, it's definitely been an important discourse over the past year.
I mean, let me just add thing, because I love the unity and togetherness and really focusing on our mission, right? We're all here to help patients and to solve really, really difficult diseases and problems, and to use this conflict and say, hey, we need to come together and work together, but everybody comes from a different place. And one of the things that we've tried, because we really are multilingual, is to make people understand that, you know, in America, you know, one needs to be sensitive about politics, because if you're living in X, Y, and Z, maybe you have a different view, or your culture. And we sort of use it as a, you know, we want to have a safe, open, and respectful environment. And then the key was bringing everybody together on the mission and what we're doing. And we're all working together to get there.
Awesome, that's great. Thank you, guys. Another point that I wanted to discuss was some points about gender that our report revealed. So both our 2020 salary report as well as the D&I report, they both indicated that significant disparities in gender still prevail, not necessarily in like representation, but in things, you know, on their perspectives of fairness, on promotions and earnings. So how do organizations continue to make progress in prioritizing gender equality in the workplace?
So I'll take that, Chantel. A couple of thoughts, and let's start with your point on pay equity, because that's a really important one. So I'm going to make some recommendations to the women who are listening, and also to leaders in general. So I think number one is understand your value. Women, data has shown, are less likely to negotiate at the time of hire. They're less likely to request a pay increase. And so I think it's really important to know your value. And if you feel that you are being underpaid, to step up and have that conversation. I think it's incumbent on leaders to ensure that you're regularly taking a look at your pay equity. And where you see disparities, you're really thinking critically about what's the cause of that. So for instance, is it a recruiting challenge where, again, that negotiation is happening when people are coming in the door and there aren't kind of clear guidelines or practices of maintaining pay equity at that starting point? Is it a representation of the problem with advancing women in your organization and supporting development? Get to the root of where the issue is and then do work from there. I also think it's important for leaders to share those results. And again, to everyone on the call, I think it's a request you should make to your organization if they're not doing it. And acknowledging a problem and articulating a plan to address it is as important as sharing good data. So I think those are some really important points on the pay equity. I think the second topic I would point to is flexibility. So, we know across industries in the past 12 months, I think the last figure I heard was more than 2 million women have dropped out of the workforce. What an extraordinary loss, and lots of reasons for that, but a lot of it revolves around flexibility. I think we have to bury the concept of work-life balance because it just doesn't exist. I think we really have to focus on integration, and COVID has really brought this to the forefront for all of us, right? It's the most extreme example for those of us who live and work on Zoom between integrating work and life. You're bringing people into your homes every day. And even if you use those different backgrounds to kind of mask the differences in where we live, it also means that you've got the appearance of cats, of children, of parents, of roommates. I think embracing that integration and rather than having those experiences feel uncomfortable or shaming, organizations that embrace them and just recognize this is a reflection of who we are. And we're all equally managing this integration of our work and life. Having open conversations about if these are the outcomes we're trying to achieve, what do you need to get there? So that the flexibility is certainly at a company level to the degree that it's possible. Now, we all work in an industry that has people coming on site for labs for manufacturing. Flexibility there is different than flexibility in the full home working from home space. I also think that topic of flexibility is so important, not only for women, but for men, for their partners and spouses that are supporting them. And it's a very important factor to attract the talent we want because it's more and more important to people for various reasons, not just family. I think the last thing you touched on was about professional development and women rising into leadership roles. And there, I think the one point I would emphasize is really expanding our lens and definition of what leadership traits we value most. Yeah. So I think those organizations that emphasize what are typically masculine traits demand then that women adapt, conform to maybe behaviors that are unnatural to them. And again, this topic, like the others, goes beyond the gender lines to all forms of diversity. But expanding that lens to, what is influence? There are many different ways to influence that can be equally effective. And I think that's absolutely critical to supporting development and growth and more women in leadership.
I just want to add that the 2 million figure, which is, I believe it's the last one I saw, is alarming. I mean, this massive exodus of women, within the workforce is setting back all of the movements and gains, the small gains that we've made over the past decade. So we're essentially going back, and it's very, very alarming. At Amgen, we prioritize this. It's been a priority, and it's been on our radar for some time, but we've accelerated efforts. To Jennifer's point, the professional development, we've created, we're looking at 3 different programs and how we elevate it in a very intentional manner, where we're also taking into consideration that these programs cannot be designed in a cookie cutter approach, because what a Latina or a Black and African American woman needs, or an Asian American, are very unique, and because they experience the workforce very differently. And so how do you tailor it to ensure that you have the components of a program? And the 3 programs are mentoring, sponsorship, and succession planning. We're really honing in on the succession planning, looking at mentoring, because organizations create these mentoring programs, don't really look at the design efficacy and the impact, and really looking at root cause analysis, because in my work in this space for over 10 years, I've seen mentoring programs and they've been thrown together, and again, no impact or headway has been made. So now we're being very intentional, bringing in thought leaders, experts around how do you develop robust programs where you can not just measure its efficacy, but to speak to each individual that participates to see the impact. Did it meet the expectation set? And also, how are our senior leaders involved, particularly the men that holds a lot of the influence and power? How are they being active and proactive allies? And so that is what we're really honing in on. And I will say at Amgen, we have a lot of great male leaders who are not just executive sponsors for our women ERGs, but also are working to mentor, sponsor, and develop succession planning, thinking about, in what are the 5 top females that I can identify that as I have upward mobility, that they can as well. And so, really assessing what you have in place and ensuring that you also take the women of color perspective into consideration when designing.
I'll just make one comment on one aspect. I mean, I think you guys, nailed everything in terms of sort of the breadth of the diversity actually that exists in that question, right? One observation, right? If we look at salary surveys, we look at benchmarks, we look at all of that, nowhere actually is there any mention of gender, differences in backgrounds, race, ethnicity, nothing. I just fundamentally, I don't understand where that actually creeps in. And, one of the collateral sort of benefits that has occurred actually in Massachusetts, which is, a couple of years ago, Massachusetts passed a law that you can't ask people their previous salary. I think that's the best thing that happened, because honestly, when you start benchmarking people from their previous salary, all the inequities that they face because of whatever sort of carries throughout their life, And I mean, personally, I'll tell you where I stand personally on it and where then Omega stands. And I think that's kind of, important for all of us to think through is essentially we pay for the role and we pay for the experience. We don't pay for anything else. And it's at the benchmark, at a certain level. And most of the offers that we make, and look, I'm talking about offers because we are a new company, we're growing by leaps and bounds, right? So we are more in terms of actually being able to set the tone than fix something, Jen, like you guys have to do at Amgen, which is historically there, right? Essentially, there is very little room for negotiation when an offer is made, because we make really good offers. That's kind of what I want to actually put out there, because look, any employee joining, right, the last thing you want is somebody coming in and worrying about that they're not making enough money. That makes no sense. If you're bringing them in, men, women, equally, across all races, across all nationalities, genders, what have you, bring them in, take it off the table, then they're going to perform their best. That's a very commonsensical thing. And I just personally, I don't understand where the space is for inequity. And I think I do understand intellectually, I don't get it. In reality, I get it. And I think that's what we all need to commit to, that this doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. And I think just circling back to one of Jennifer's points as well, I don't think that we should be placing all the onus of, salary negotiations, for example, like on the individual negotiating their salary, because they only know what they know. And so, I do think that leadership should be making that effort. As Jennifer said, it's a two-way street. But knowledge is definitely power when it comes to salary negotiations, right? And so to everyone on this call, I would say, if you are a life sciences professional, there are resources that you can use to help in terms of understanding what are typical salaries in your region, what are typical salaries in your discipline. There are those resources there. For example, not to plug BioSpace, but we do release an annual salary report every year that benchmarks exactly this. And the reason we bring it up is because it has found that there are very large disparities, sometimes up to 28, 30% disparities in salaries when you cut the data and looking at people's gender within the same disciplines and within similar job titles. So it is something that is of a concern that we are hoping the increase in knowledge for individuals helps them with their own advocacy and helps them feel that confidence to negotiate more, whether you're a woman or you're, of an ethnic minority, for example, but it's important that we continue to follow those trends, but remember that the responsibility lies not just with the potential employee, but also with the employer to create an environment where they are confident to negotiate as well. So we're starting to run out of time. I can see that we just have a few minutes left. So I'm just going to kind of allow an opportunity for some closing remarks from each of you. What is sort of the one final piece of advice that you would give to other organizations that has actually made a positive impact on D&I in your workplace? What's the kind of final thought that you would like to leave with all of our listeners here today?
I'll hop in. So I think focus on your mid-level managers because they have an extraordinary impact on shaping an inclusive culture and really developing, rewarding, and advancing talent. So I'd encourage everybody to not just rely on the tone from the top, but really invest in those mid-level managers.
I'll definitely echo that sentiment. We often find that there's a bottleneck in the middle management and and so it's really important to rely on the pull through. And I think there was a question, I was looking at the chat, and there's a question that was posed around, is this going to stick? Having been in the space for over 10 years, not that long, but I certainly see that there's this inherent desire now more than ever. I would say to continue, to ensure there's resources allocated and really thinking about transformative change that would bring everyone along on the journey. And so how do you engage all employees where they're at? And I know that's a huge feat, but that's why we call it a journey.
Yeah, to pick up on the theme of the journey, Jen, I would say it is actually a continuous journey. The work is never done. That's the message I would actually really leave people with.
So I think the last thing, as an industry, we need to push to normalize diversity and focus on inclusion. Our industry is based on science, right? And science is very, very diverse. And we need to really focus on that. And we really believe at Athera that it's our differences that create innovation. And it's our differences that find a solution. And it's our differences that persevere. And so we need to just keep encouraging that in an industry. And lastly, I just want to thank everybody for joining this. This is such an important discussion. Thank you, Chantel, BioSpace. And I just want to say that I'm honored to be a part of this panel.
And to just add to what Mark just said, those differences, to me, the one thing you can do is just really create that space for people to talk, to be able to share about each other, to share their perspectives with each other. It is really easy to get super busy in your day job and just be heads down doing that same thing over and over again, and to not actually take the time to create that community and those things that bring us together. So, if there's one thing you do, it's make sure there's room for people to be able to do that and sort of bring themselves to work.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think we're going to have to wrap it there. We're right at time, but thank you so much to all our panelists for participating. I think you've really demonstrated all the different things that we can do as employers to support D&I initiatives, to create more successful workplaces. To everyone who is listening, we will be following up with a recording of today's session, so you can expect an email. If you want to review it, you want to share it with colleagues. And we're going to also include links to the diversity and inclusion report that we referenced here today, as well as our salary report from 2020. So thank you so much for your time. And, we hope you enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks.
Thank you, Chantal.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.